From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
Federal funding for affordable internet could soon run out, but the state may have an answer for that. Plus, lawmakers finally agree on a tax relief plan, but will it meet the governor's measure of a good proposal, or will she say, no way? But first, a long-awaited settlement in a lawsuit over a controversial police gang list in Wichita. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Well, this is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but less than an hour before we began recording this show, breaking news, if you want to call it that in this show, from the governor's office, announcing she's vetoed 6 bills and allowed a 7th to become law without her signature. Let's take a look. On that veto list, first up was SB 233. That's the controversial bill that bans gender-affirming care for minors. She says it got between parents and doctors and violated the parents' rights. Also vetoed HB 2749, which mandated doctors that provide abortions ask patients the reason for their abortions, keep records and statistics, and report those back to the state. It did allow patients to refuse to answer the questions, though. The governor said Kansans voted against this sort of regulation when they voted down the abortion amendment. Also vetoed HB 2436, which created the crime of abortion coercion. The governor said such a crime is already covered by laws in Kansas against threatening violence against someone, and that the bill itself was written too vaguely. Another bill we saw on there was SB 434, which deregulated sugaring for the purpose of hair removal. Opponents had raised concerns this would allow adults with no background check to do the procedure on minors, even in genital areas. The governor said she was worried about safety and sanitation problems. And then there was HB 2446, which would have banned cities like Lawrence and counties from instituting their own bans on plastic grocery bags and other plastic containers. The governor said this was a violation of home rule. She also allowed a bill that will require porn sites to verify your age using a state-issued ID before giving you access. That one becomes law without her signature, saying similar laws in other states are already being challenged in court, and we should allow that process to play out. Well, joining us today to discuss these topics, we have Dr. Russell Arbin-Fox from Friends University, political scientist. We had another guest scheduled, but couldn't make it at the last minute, so Russell and I are going to carry the flag here. As we look at all of these bills, a lot of controversial bills on this list all at once. Of course, they were all coming through the legislature all at once.
Right. I mean, there was obviously a certain amount of strategic thinking going on the part of the Republican leadership to try to, coordinate the passage of these bills, to try to build a certain amount of momentum. I don't think ultimately this scheduling effort of theirs really made much difference. All of these bills, their vetoes were relatively predictable. There was, I suppose, some question about different elements about some of the bills and whether they might be phrased in such a way that there would be some possibility for the governor to sit down with the Republican leadership and look for opportunities to, scratch each other's back on various priorities. But as it were, the way these bills were written, you could predict that the governor was going to veto them, and the governor did.
Well, certainly SB 233, that was the transgender affirming care bill, and hugely controversial. Got a lot of discussion before it passed. We even had, just in this last week, students walking out of class at Wichita East High School in protest against it. But again, not really a surprise that she vetoed it. She's pretty much vetoed every other transgender bill that's come through.
It's pretty clear if you take a look at Governor Kelly's whole political history that she's not really a culture warrior. She's not somebody who's deeply invested in a lot of these controversial issues having to do with sexuality and gender, but she is someone who strongly holds to some progressive liberal opinions. And especially when you have seen, not just in the state of Kansas, but across the whole United States, the idea of pushing back against the demands, the interests, the rights, the perspectives of people associated with the LGBT community, particularly transgender individuals. It's been obvious that she was going to see that movement as something that she was going to take a stand against. And she has done so in past bills. She's been successful in vetoing and preventing an override in some cases, less successful in others. We'll see how this one turns out. There's going to be a huge amount of attention paid to the actions of the legislature in terms of trying to put together an effort to overturn this veto. If you count up the numbers, if you take a look at the votes, it's a real possibility. And that's going to fire up the same sort of people that, participated in the walkout. It's going to fire up young people. It's going to fire up progressive activists. It's going to fire up people in the LGBTQ community. There's going to be a great deal of attention focused on the ultimate fate of this one bill. It's really going to kind of overshadow, I think, despite the importance that a lot of people attach to abortion, I suspect that the effort to overturn this bill is going to overshadow any other efforts the legislature makes in regards to any of these other bills.
And I would have to go back and take a look. I don't remember the exact numbers, whether or not it had a veto-proof majority in both houses coming through. But I know at least some of these bills did not. We know last year she vetoed a record number or close to record number of bills, and the Republican legislature overturned the vast majority of them.
Yeah. The votes are obviously there for some of these things. They're not going to be there for all of the things. It would be interesting to watch the Republican leadership, especially in the midst of, much more high-profile fights over transgender people, over abortion rights. It would be interesting to see if they actually, try to organize an overturn of her veto of the plastic bag ban. Because the votes are clearly not there, not unless they're able to come up with an argument to get a couple of Republicans to shift their votes. You have, a few Republicans that really are quite serious about this idea of home rule. Or even if they're not, really philosophically serious about it, they clearly recognize this sort of action by the state, trying to disrupt the ability of cities and counties to enact, essentially environmental regulations that they think are beneficial for where they live, that in the long term are actually financially beneficial to a lot of retail outlets because, it saves them from having to deal with the costs of plastic bags. They just see this as a step too far. And so even if they're not doctrinaire home rule people, they're going to be in agreement with the governor about that issue. So
yeah, and in fact, on that particular topic, I know home rule has been the stumbling block for that bill. It's been tried several times over the last few years and always failed because of the home rule objection.
because you have a few key Republican legislators who, as I said, either they're deeply philosophically committed to this idea of delivering more governing power to municipalities and counties, or even if they're not, they genuinely believe, come on, this sort of thing is clearly the sort of thing that we ought to allow cities and counties to decide for themselves. When you're talking about, dealing with plastic bags, you've seen cities across the country enact similar sorts of bans. A lot of cities and counties have enacted not bans, but different types of regulations. And this bill would take away that power entirely. It's not just a plastic bag ban. It's a plastic bag regulation ban. Yeah. And again, as long as you have those few Republicans, an override just isn't going to work. But, they've tried the override before. Maybe they'll try it again.
Well, and there are some bills that works on where we see it come back year after year after year until finally they chip away and get that last vote they need. Well, moving on to our previously scheduled topics of the week, the Wichita City Council this week voted unanimously to accept a $625,000 settlement over the police department's gang list. The ACLU, Kansas Appleseed, and Progeny all wanted the list erased, saying it's unconstitutional and unconstitutionally intentionally targets Wichitans of color. This settlement will let the police keep the list while clarifying the criteria for who ends up on it and setting up a way for anyone in the public to find out if their name happens to be on the list and appeal that placement. KSN's Derek Lytle got reaction from those who wanted the list gone.
Growing outcry for change.
There's a lot of concern about the gang file.
Councilmember Brandon Johnson says youth could be placed on the gang file simply for being at the same event as active gang members. He says it's something he could have fallen victim to.
Growing up, a lot of my friends were Bloods or Crips. And though I never joined, I could have been labeled as an associate. That may have brought different attention on me.
He believes removing the associate category will prevent excessive court costs for someone who may have no criminal history.
A registered gang member and that goes to court with you, your bail is automatically set at $50,000. And that's something that was that what really started my push for reform on the gang file.
Removing the inactive category will also allow someone who has not taken part in gang activity for years to file an appeal to get off the list. People will also now have the ability to find out if they're listed on the gang file. Progeny founder Marquita Atkins Woods says it's a step towards clarity.
Finally getting a settlement and being able to have governance around how people are put on this list and have transparency for people to know that they are actually on this list.
A third party will be involved, making a report every 6 months to monitor if WPD is following through with the changes.
Hopefully, this is a building block or one step to us being able to start to build in a way that's healthier.
So I guess the big question for a lot of Wichitans is, can this compromise work? I mean, the city has a history of, there's a problem, let's get a study, let's do a compromise, let's do a settlement, and then nothing happens.
Yeah. Obviously, you know, for people like Councilmember Johnson and other people that have made the gang list, you know, a real issue, you know, that demands reform, that demands change for quite a long time. You know, they're looking at this settlement and they're hoping that it's going to force the kind of changes that will actually stick. I think that there's reason to be at least moderately hopeful about that, and that's because as we know from years of watching the city council arguments over the Wichita Police Department and so forth, a lot of the time these types of issues generate intense heat amongst a small group of activists and a small group of police defenders, and they don't really penetrate, you know, the larger consciousness out there. But certain elements of the WPD's practices here, like for instance the fact that people couldn't find out if their names were on the list, and therefore there was no way for them to even know whether or not there was anything they ought to be doing in order to effectively protect themselves from, you know, the possibility of false arrests or anything along those lines. I mean, that's the sort of thing that actually elicited reaction from, I think, a broader base of civil libertarians and other people that are concerned about personal rights. So I'm hoping that the attention that this was able to draw, you know, a somewhat broader base attention than might usually be the case, bodes well for it. Unfortunately, as with, you know, past issues involving the WPD that we've talked about before, you know, we may just have to wait and see on this.
Well, there's also another issue that was up from the State House. If you were watching last week, we began with a discussion of whether lawmakers would be able to reach a compromise on a tax relief package. It took them well into the night, in fact, until about 2 a.m. Saturday morning to do it, but they did manage. Now, will the governor sign off on what they've come up with? I think we've come up with a really good product. Our goal all along is a tax cut for everyone. This isn't about us as individuals. I'm going to ask this body to turn down your YFM station. What's in it for me? And remember, this is for our constituents. That's what Senator Karen Tyson, chair of the Senate Tax Committee, told her fellow senators when asking them to vote on this latest compromise package. The Kansas Reflector reports the reform blueprint would reduce state revenue from property, sales, and income taxes by $636 million in the first year, $458 million in the second year, and $462 million in the third year. That totals more than $1.5 billion beyond the line in the sand Governor Laura Kelly had drawn for how much she was willing to spend on tax cuts. That could mean a veto. Senator Ethan Corson, a Johnson County Democrat, says current projections indicate the state could face a $392 million deficit by 2029 if this tax bill becomes law. The Senate voted for it 24-9, not a veto-proof majority. The House voted 119-0 to send it to Governor Kelly. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have been taking to social media ever since, pumping up the benefits of this bill to Kansas voters. And I think that's the big question is, will the governor let this become law? She's been very adamant about not wanting to set us up to go back into a deficit,
right,
and wanting to be fiscally sound. But at the same time, this is legislation that she'll be going against prominent members of her own party on if she vetoes it.
And because this legislation does accomplish things that have been a priority for multiple legislators across the political aisle. I mean, obviously, you know, the kind of structural reforms that they're talking about here are very much more out of the Republican wish list than the Democratic wish list. But it didn't go all the way for what the Republican leadership initially were asking for. You know, we're not getting a single tax rate. We're not getting an effective flat tax or something like that. But, you know, we are seeing some changes in you know, how tax rates are going to be assessed, and that is going to have some real consequences in terms of revenue on down the line. Along the way, however, you have a lot of benefits to a lot of working Kansans. You have a lot of things being cleaned up in the tax code. Of course, there's always going to be things to clean up in the tax codes because the tax code is always being tweaked every single year. So it's going to be a difficult decision. You know, she stated at the beginning of this whole process that she is entirely prepared to call the legislature back for a summer session if things are not resolved in regards to, you know, obviously the budget overall, but in particular education funding. You know, she now has to decide to what degree is she willing to maybe pick some fights with members of her own party in order to follow through on what she saw as the correct path that Kansas's you know, finances need to be put on. This isn't wildly departing from what she wanted, but it's definitely not what she hoped for. You know, the concerns that this is, you know, over a number of years going to bring us back to where we were before. The whole thing that she ran on, you know, against the Brownback legacy when she was first elected as governor, she definitely doesn't want to contemplate that. But she probably also doesn't want to contemplate, you know, riling up a lot of hardworking Democrats that have supported her in other ways who want to be able to go back to their constituents and say, hey, I finally got this for you. So I really don't know how she'll go with this. It's an open question to me.
Yeah, it's really an interesting one. And, you know, maybe she goes the route that she did with the porn access bill and lets it become law without signing it.
That would be an interesting move for, you know, a state budget, though. Yeah. I mean, you know, for the porn bill, I mean, it was similar in the sense that while it is, you know, predominantly a Republican creation, there were a fair number of Democrats that were supportive of that bill, and they had good reasons to support that bill. They thought it was, you know, important in accomplishing certain aims. So, you know, there, once again, she's looking at maybe not antagonizing members of her own party, but there's also the fact that that has an obvious civil liberties angle to it that's going to resolve in, you know, court action. That's not the case with a budget, or at least isn't necessarily so. So I would be somewhat surprised if she, you know, decided to essentially, you know, let it become law without putting her signature on it. But,
okay,
you know, that's certainly an option still available to her.
Well, I don't have any money to put on any options, so we're going to just have to wait and find out. Internet price hikes for low-income Americans could begin in May as federal subsidies run dry without congressional approval for an extension. That's according to the FCC. This would affect almost 134,000 Kansas homes currently getting the federal aid and paying for internet access. But as KSN's Craig Andrus shows us, Kansas is working to expand internet access all on its own.
it's helping. Every little bit helps.
As CEO of SC Telecom and Medicine Lodge, Carla Shear's company got a grant back in 22 to help get fiber into the ground in rural areas to get good internet. It's a task that can cost many thousands per mile.
But there's still a great need because there are still many Kansans that don't have service that's reliable or affordable.
But help is on the way.
So the money is there. It's still projected to not be enough, but the money is coming.
Eric Sartorius is with Communications Coalition of Kansas and says Kansas has been allocated $451 million for internet development by the feds, but it will still take some time to get the programs rolling out across Kansas.
So it could be 2025, 2026, 2027 for some of these projects to get done.
He also says getting a mapping plan out is what the Kansas Office of Broadband Development and others are working towards, to have a plan to spend almost $500 million in federal money to get internet in hard-to-reach places. As for the companies putting in broadband in rural America, real working broadband may be the push needed to see more people move back home.
They were raised here and born here. They went off to the city. They've kind of done their things, but when they're ready to have a family, they want to come back and maybe live on the family farm or live in some of these small rural communities.
Talking about folks coming back and wanting to live in these rural communities but needing this access, I remember having a conversation with a state senator a few years ago where their idea for future success in Kansas was to turn us into the work from home, the remote work center of the country. I mean, certainly it's cheaper to live here than pretty much anywhere else.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, as we have seen, not just in the state of Kansas, where, you know, there's been, you know, financial policies in place to try to encourage people to relocate to smaller communities for a while. I mean, it's, you know, not having a massive effect, and that hasn't been the case, you know, across the United States. In other states with large unpopulated rural sections, you know, they've tried similar things in regards to, you know, subsidizing home purchases and, you know, providing travel allowances, that sort of thing, and it doesn't really move the needle that much. Now, you know, as for whether or not, you know, a real serious investment or a significant reform in the sorts of things that would allow greater broadband access all across the state, whether that would have a significant impact, I mean, you know, there's still going to be all sorts of variables that come into play, you know, a quality of life and whatnot. I think the more immediate issue is that the people that do live in Western Kansas, the people that are settled there, the people that are working in agriculture, the people that are involved in, you know, the rural industries of Western Kansas, they're increasingly dependent in so many ways on fast, reliable, you know, high-powered internet connections. I mean, we're talking about farmers that are making use of high-tech equipment that, you know, coordinates with a GPS, that draws upon meteorological data, you know, when they're determining how they're going to irrigate, how they're going to fertilize, on a day-by-day basis, sometimes on an hour-by-hour basis. I mean, so these things are imperative for the people who live there. Whether or not providing these things would actually change the numbers of people who want to live in those parts of Kansas, I mean, that's an important conversation that has to be continued to take place. But the people that are there have their own sets of concerns as well.
Well, talking about affordable housing, that's our next topic. Even as Kansas fights to find enough of it for everyone, some cities have entire ghost neighborhoods with abandoned homes. KAKE's Eli Higgins found two of them owned by the city of Wichita just this last week. Here's a look at the situation.
And just seeing it like this, it's probably, is there like a sense of nostalgia or anything?
Yeah, for sure. Oh my goodness. Just sitting out here, like we used to sit on the front porch and, you know, just look at the neighborhood. You know, my dad, especially, you know, with his can of beer, whatever, sit out there in the front porch, my stepmom, you know, and just watching the kids play out here, and to see it like this, where there's nothing here.
This is the home in South Wichita where Winedra Bell grew up, raised kids, and even became a grandma. A vibrant neighborhood that people used to describe like this.
We had block parties, we had the children everywhere. I mean, it was nice. It was real homey.
now looks like this.
It's sad. It's sad. It's like a ghost town here. You know, it's not the same at all.
City Councilman Mike Hoheisel says the city owns nearly 50 homes in this neighborhood on Hydraulic just north of I-135, and most of them have been abandoned and boarded up for about 5 years now.
It's an understandable concern because you don't want to see that in your neighborhood.
Hoheisel says the good news is the city has approval from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and available funds from the American Rescue Plan Act to renovate and sell the homes 12 at a time. He says while there's always a lot of red tape dealing with Washington, one of the big advantages he's had to get the ball rolling versus a similar city-owned ghost town sitting stagnant near I-135 and 21st is that it's easier to get environmental approval from HUD in this area.
Each of these homes also has to have an environmental report about that thick coming along with it for us to put it back out on the market.
Bell says after it's fixed up, she'd even consider buying her old house back. She just hopes the city gets it done sooner than later.
There's no life here, you know, and I want it to come back. I really do.
In Wichita, Eli Higgins, Cake News on your side.
And I think to me the most interesting thing about this is the city is selling off the public housing homes that it owns, getting out of the public housing business, shall we say, moving to just Section 8 vouchers. Except they already can't find enough landlords that will accept the vouchers that exist now, and they're talking about adding more.
It is just a very, very difficult problem. I actually just finished today a new book that's going to be published here in a week or so by Charles Marone, talking about how to really wrestle with what he calls the housing trap. And one of his primary themes is exactly the point that you make about Section 8 housing. So we see all these problems with public housing. So we're going to create vouchers to work with private landlords. But they, of course, don't necessarily want to accept the Section 8 vouchers because there's all sorts of financial disincentives they're dealing with. And so we keep going around in this circle as we struggle to create affordable housing. And there's no straightforward solution. There's some really interesting experiments out there with different approaches to public housing. There's different ways in which we can talk about incremental financing to try to encourage infill development. But there's a lot of different angles that have to be considered.
And we're going to have to leave it there because we are out of time. Just two of us, and we filled the entire time slot. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching. We'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, Cake News, and KSN News for sharing their materials with us. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Stay safe and have a great week.